Stop scrolling if you work for the government, if you know someone who works for the government, or if you're just curious about what's going on with all of these firings. Over the past few weeks, I've made several videos looking at constitutional law and procedural due process and how they've developed over the years, from viewing government jobs as privileges that can be taken away on a whim, to property rights that are harder to take away, and that the Constitution will protect, and also why those changes have happened over time. And as I've said in these other videos, the Constitution does not provide a right to these jobs. These jobs have been found to be property, and that property is what cannot be taken away without due process under the Fifth and 14th Amendment. And due process is the process or procedures that are due or owed to a person before the government can take property away. For a good chunk of American history, government jobs weren't protected at all. If a new president took office, he would just fire thousands of workers overnight because they didn't support him. When Andrew Jackson became president in 1828, he fired 10% of the entire federal workforce and replaced them with supporters who'd helped him get elected in exchange for the promise of government jobs. Jackson's massive political turnover of government workers created what became known as the spoils system. To the winner go the spoils. And after Jackson, the spoils system quickly became the norm. New government workers even had to pay a fee once they were hired called an assessment to fund the next election. This spoil system went on for decades, until a man named Charles Guiteau, who had been denied a job in the Garfield administration that he felt he deserved after playing his part in the Garfield campaign, ended the Garfield administration rather abruptly with a revolver. This drew enough attention to the spoil system that Congress finally brought it to an end. And in 1883, Congress decided it was time to start hiring government employees who were actually trained or experienced or in some way prepared to do the jobs they were doing for the government. And so they passed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act and created today's civil service. Now, not every government employee is part of the civil service. Some are still political appointees, which are basically just leftovers from the spoils system, and are just appointed because they worked on the campaign. But their jobs are usually more political in nature, like a press secretary. These are jobs given to campaign workers after a win. But government employees hired within the civil service system are hired based on their qualifications, not based on their work in a political campaign. Unlike, say, a press secretary whose political savvy is part of the job, a USDA meat inspector probably should know something about meat. It doesn't necessarily matter who they voted for. But merit-based hiring loses some of its teeth if the incoming president can still just fire everyone and they have to be replaced anyway, right? So the Pendleton Act also created legal protections for those new civil servants to keep them from being fired on a whim by a new president. It's also important to note that since the civil service tended to prioritize hiring veterans who may have had trouble finding jobs elsewhere, these legal protections also helped to keep veterans employed, which cut down on things like veteran homelessness and other things that the government needed to deal with. But none of these protections are constitutional, they're all just statutory. They come from Congress. So how did we end up where we are today, with constitutional due process protecting government jobs, and why does the difference matter? Well, let's tie all of this together. I'm Brian, I make videos about law and civics. Please let me know in the comments if you or someone you know has recently lost a job, and let me know what you think about government jobs being protected. And please like and repost this video, get this information out there. This is important information for us all to understand. Also, thank you Allison, Maxwell, and Tiffany for your support. If anybody's interested in supporting me, there are a bunch of ways to do it. In my profile, there's a link, or go to my link tree. Now, we're going to start with a fun little drawing that looks terrible because that's sort of my thing. Ta-da! This right here is why I didn't become an artist. All right, I want you to think of a government job as a tree. But for right now, a tree that's just been stuck in some dirt. For right now, this tree, this government job, is pretty easy to knock over because there's nothing holding it in the ground. But roots, like the Pendleton Act, give it something to hold onto the ground with. Boom! Now we've got a root, something that's holding this tree in the ground and giving it something to hang on to. Now the court has said over the years that for a job to turn from one that has no property rights into one that does, something has to convince the employee that they have a long-term job. And that thing can't be ridiculous. It needs to be reasonable. And that thing becomes a root. Put another way, if the court agrees that employee had a reasonable expectation that their job would continue based on some thing that they can point to, a root, then that employee job becomes property. For this, we had two perfect examples that we talked about in another video that explain this really well. They're two cases, both from 1972. I'll run through them real fast. They're called Roth and Sinderman. And they're perfect examples because they are almost exactly the same situation. But the court went two different ways. Each was about a professor, a government employee. Each professor had a limited time contract. Let's say, for simplicity, both contracts ended on June 30th. And when they expired, both professors weren't fired, they just didn't have jobs anymore. And both thought, I should have had a review or something to tell me why they didn't hire me for another year. And the court said one did get a review and one didn't. Because during the orientation, they told one of the professors We don't have a state tenure law here, which is a law that protects professors from being fired and often means professors are basically hired forever. But if you do your job well and you come to all the meetings and whatever, we want you to feel like you have tenure. The other professor didn't have anything like that. But the court said, you know what? That first professor, it wasn't in his contract, but they basically told him, you do X, Y, and Z, we're going to rehire you. And so when he did those things and they didn't rehire him, they should have told him why. The second professor, he doesn't have anything like that. The first professor had a root in his job. The second professor did not. That root was something reasonable for him to point to and rely on. The second professor did not have anything like that. And so because he had this root, the court called this tree property. And the Constitution won't let the government take property without due process. So let's look at roots a little closer real quick. Roots can come in a variety of different forms. A root could be a statute like the Pendleton Act. Maybe the statute says, hey, you can't fire this guy for no reason. Or it could be another kind of statute like a state tenure law. The root might lie in your contract, some specific language in there. I mean, the root could lie in any number of things. It could lie in your handbook, in something they said to you during orientation, your collective bargaining agreement, as long as whatever you relied on was reasonable. But once you have a root, this tree gets a lot harder to pull over. Okay, so you've determined that you have a root. That means you have a property right in this job. Does that mean that the government can't take your job away? Absolutely not. It just has to do something first. So let's look at what that means. The 5th and 14th Amendment create this little rock wall around our tree. And of course, our nice little archway. But in the middle of the archway, we have this little gate. And this gate is known as due process. Now, the due process gate isn't made out of barbed wire. All you have to do is open it. But whereas before, without these roots, the government could just come over here and pull the tree down. Now they got to go through the gate, get out a chainsaw, and hack this thing open. So first, they've got to open the gate. And the Constitution, under the 5th and 14th Amendment, require them to come and open this gate before they chop the tree down. That's it. They just have to go in, open the gate, and then they can go and take the tree. So what is the due process? What do you have to do to get this gate open? Well, it depends on a couple of things. First, it's going to depend on what the job is, and we'll get into that in a second. And then there are different procedures depending on the roots. But let's talk about a couple of examples. There might be some pre-termination protections, like notice might be required. They may have to send you a letter that says you are possibly in trouble and you might be fired. You might be guaranteed an opportunity to respond to that letter. In some cases, you're guaranteed a hearing where you get to come in and respond to that letter in person. That's usually called a Louderman hearing after Louderman v. Cleveland Board of Education, 1985, I think. And then after an employee is terminated, they have appeal options. So for federal employees, there was a law passed in 1978 called the Civil Service Reform Act, which created, among many other things, the Merit Systems Protection Board, which is basically just an appeal board that once you are terminated, you can appeal your hearing to and go and rehash and see whether they actually fired you for the right reason or not. There are also grievance procedures built in for union workers, and eventually, if none of this works out, you can go directly to the court system. Now, different employees may also get different levels of protection, so let's talk about that for a second. First, let's talk about career civil service employees. Those are the ones who were hired under the Pendleton Act, under the merit-based system. They went through the most work to get their job. They went through a probationary period to prove they were good at their job. They have the best roots to hold on to their job, the strongest property rights in their job, and therefore the most due process. It's a lot of work to get the gate open before you can get in and chop their tree down. But there are also other rules and laws in place to protect some other employees. Union employees may have their own special things. Professors and teachers may have tenure laws in place. That's usually at the state level. And state employees all over the country have their own protections, but some employees have a lot less protection. Let's talk about those. First, you have probationary government employees. These are employees who went through the Pendleton Act, through the merit-based system to get hired, but they've only been there for a short period of time, so they haven't also proven that they're good at their job yet. They don't have zero due process, but they don't have a lot. They have a lot less than someone who's been there long enough to have already proven that they're good at the job that they were hired for. Then you have independent contractors. Basically, they have whatever due process is written into their contract, but usually not a lot is written into their contract. It's usually something specific, and they don't usually get this sort of due process. And then finally, you have political appointees. Political appointees are people hired outside of the Pendleton Act. These are basically the spoil system leftovers. And because they were brought in as a favor to the president, they can be let go as a favor to the president. They have absolutely no protection under this system. But again, these are people whose specialties are usually politics rather than, say, meat inspection or engineering. So they weren't hired based on their merit. they were hired based on their participation in a campaign. Okay, let's wrap this all up. According to the Supreme Court, a government employee's job becomes property when it's rooted in something that the government employee reasonably relies on to provide long-term employment. Roots could be found in a contract, in statute, in a handbook, or at an orientation, in their collective bargaining agreement, as long as whatever it's rooted in is reasonable. We protect government employees because we wanted a system where employees were hired based on their skills at their jobs and not who they supported in their campaign. And now the Constitution protects those jobs from arbitrary firings without due process by forcing the government to open the due process gate before they chop the tree down. Now, there are a bunch more statutes over the years that protect federal civil service employees, but in general, they tend to do a few basic things. They reduce the interaction of the civil service and politics. They try to keep them as separate as possible. They protect whistleblowers to varying degrees. They boost the idea of hiring based on merit and including veterans. And they generally organize and reorganize the hiring process, HR, due process systems, all of that. So that is sort of everything we need to know about due process and government employment. Drop some comments and likes, reshare so people can get to know this stuff. Go back and watch the other videos to get some more background, and if you keep watching these, I will keep making them. Thank you guys so much for your support. If you want to support me in other ways, please go check out my profile, my link tree. You guys are keeping me going, so I really appreciate your help and support. Thanks a lot, guys.